All right, welcome back to 2.2 European colonization. This is the second topic of historical period 2. The theme that we're focusing on today is migration and settlement. The learning objective that you should be able to master at the end of the lecture is explain how and why various European colonies developed and expanded from 1607 to 1754. So, first key concept is the Spanish efforts to extract wealth from the land led them to develop institutions based on subjugating native populations, converting them to Christianity, and incorporating them with enslaved and free Africans into Spanish colonial society. This is all a continuity from period one. We're going to see Spanish missions being established in the second historical period. Intermarriage and religious conversions, they're going to continue, and that's going to further incorporate non-Spanish into colonial society and make Latin America dominated by mestizos, so people who are of mixed ancestry that are native and Spanish. And they will continue to use enslaved African labor in the mines and the sugar cane plantations in the Caribbean. The French are going to have their first settlement in North America in Quebec in 1608, and that's going to be founded by Samuel de Champlain. So here, this key concept is all about the French and Dutch colonial efforts. They're going to involve relatively few Europeans and rely on trade alliances and intermarriage with American Indians to build economic and diplomatic relations and acquire furs and other products for exports to Europe. So that starts in Quebec in 1608. By the 1670s, Marquette ends up going to the northern portion of the Mississippi River, and then De La Salle is going to make it all the way down the Mississippi River, and finally New Orleans is going to be established in 1718. That's going to become a large trading center to export these furs and these other North American items that they're exporting back to Europe. Now, the most of the French that went and settled in North America were traders. They didn't come in family units, as we'll see the British will later on. So the fur traders are going to be called the coureurs de bois. That translates to in French to runners of the woods, because you have to go into the woods to find these beaver pelts. And they are going to have relations with the Native Americans. They're going to ally themselves with some, and they're going to be enemies of others. Here in the picture on the bottom right, you see the French explorers led by Champlain are allying themselves with the Algonquins, and they are fighting the Iroquois. Remember, the Iroquois Confederacy was in the region where we have modern day New York. The Dutch are going to be similar to the French, and their reason for being in North America, they're going to want to trade first and export them back to Europe. The Dutch exploration began with Henry Hudson. Now, Henry Hudson was British, but his exploration was sponsored by the Dutch, and so therefore all of the claims and all the things that he explored are going to go to the Dutch. Once he comes back with maps of the things that he explored, the colony is going to be controlled by the Dutch West India Company. They're going to be given control, and they're going to be responsible for the economic activity. They are going to try and entice Dutch people to move to North America by giving them land grants. These are called patroonships. But overall, most of the Dutch that live there are going to be Dutch traders trying to extract resources to send back to Europe. Most of them are going to live near trading posts, and they're going to be less likely than the French to marry with Native Americans. And like I said in the context lecture of this historical period, their colony is going to be absorbed by the English in the late 1660s. Now moving on to English colonization. Their efforts attracted a comparatively large number of male and female British migrants, as well as other European migrants, all of whom sought social mobility, economic prosperity, religious freedom, and improved living conditions. These colonists focused on agriculture and settled on lands taken from Native Americans, from whom they lived separately. So let's focus on this first part here. The colonists included both men and women. So women coming over to North America to settle is a big deal, because that means that the men are going to be less likely to intermarry with the natives, which is going to dictate further relationships between natives and Europeans. They would come in family units, so as wives to the husbands that are settling, and sometimes they would also come in as just single women traveling on their own. Other Europeans are also going to migrate to the British colonies, especially in the middle colonies around Pennsylvania and New York, in hopes of attaining land. So it's not just going to be British people settling in the British colonies. And one of the reasons why they're moving would be religious freedom. So Catholics are being persecuted in England as the Church of England is starting to separate itself from the Catholic Church. And they're going to try and seek refuge in the colony of Maryland. Maryland was established by Lord Baltimore as a religious refuge for Catholics, but eventually Protestants are going to go in there and they will outnumber Catholics. Puritans and separatists, they're going to settle in New England. Separatists are those who believe that the new Anglican Church was still too similar to the Catholic Church, and so they wanted to separate completely from the Anglican Church. While the Puritans, they had similar views on the similarities of the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church, but instead of trying to separate completely, they wanted to purify that new Anglican Church. And because of their religious beliefs, challenging the king as the head of the Anglican Church, they escaped to North America to live free of religious persecution. Now, relations with natives, they were usually conflictual regardless of location. We'll talk about how Pennsylvania was the exception early on, but you have a list here of separate conflicts across the different colonies: the Anglo-Powhatan Wars in 1610 and 1622, the Pequot War in New England in 1636, and then Metacom's War in 1675. Now, the Pequot War and the Metacom's War are New Englanders, Puritans, trying to expel the natives that live in the area, but it's important to note that in both of these conflicts, the New Englanders had native allies. And in fact, in Metacom's War in 1675, New Englanders had the Pequots as their allies against Metacom and the confederacy of tribes that he puts together to try and battle with the New Englanders. So relationship with Native Americans and then Native relationships amongst each other were complicated, and they were not monolithic, meaning that not all Native Americans fought against Europeans, and sometimes the rivalry between Native Americans was stronger than the rivalry between Native Americans and Europeans, leading to some complicated coalitions in those wars. Now, like I said, Pennsylvania was trying to be unique in its relationship with Native Americans. When William Penn first established the colony, he traded with the Native Americans for the land that they would settle on, and that's commemorated here on the painting called Penn's Treaty with the Indians. But eventually, because of all the people seeking land that settled on Pennsylvania, they start to encroach on Native Americans' land, and again, it leads to more conflictual relations with natives. Here we're talking about the diversity in these colonies. So William Penn, he sought settlers from all over Europe. He was offering generous land grants for anyone that would settle in North America. His Quaker background really led to a more religiously tolerant colony because the Quakers themselves had experienced religious persecution while in Europe. On the left side here, you have a painting of what a Quaker meeting looked like. And you see both the men and women there. They were both able to speak up at these meetings, and they were more equal in their religious beliefs and gender roles. Now, on the right side, you have a etching from Germantown, Pennsylvania, and this depicts the Pennsylvania Dutch. So the Pennsylvania Dutch are a group that still claim descendants in Pennsylvania, and they still live in somewhat isolated communities even to this day, but they are not Dutch from the Netherlands. They are actually the Pennsylvania Deutsch. So Deutsch is the word for German, but just over time it has devolved into people calling them the Dutch. And so they, even to this day, they speak a version of German in Pennsylvania in these small communities. Now, economic activities that were prevalent across the colonies, we said that in New England, because of the lack of good soil, they really practiced things like shipbuilding. As you see on the picture of the right, that diagram is what common shipbuilding looked like during the time period. And then elsewhere, you had agriculture. In the southern colonies, it was tobacco. The tobacco plant is seen there on the bottom left, and they would be grown on large plantations that required the plants to not just be grown, harvested, but they would also go through a drying process, which is what you're seeing on the bottom right. At first, the plantations were being worked on by white Europeans or British workers that would come to the colonies under the head right system. So they were indentured servants. They would sign a contract in which they would give labor to a plantation owner for a set amount of time, and in return, they would have their passage paid for to North America. At the end of their contract, they would sometimes be rewarded with land or with supplies. Um, and as time went on, the land rewards at the end of indentured contracts were less and less ideal, which meant that more indentured servants had to sign another contract of indenture, leading to a larger proportion of unhappy landless whites in the plantation colonies, which will lead to Bacon's Rebellion and the rise of enslaved African labor in the British colonies. All right, we'll talk about those other things later, but for now, the recap on this topic: the French explored widely across North America using the St. Lawrence and the Mississippi River. The Dutch settled in modern-day New York. They were involved in the fur trade. The British colonies were established for religious freedom, especially in New England and Maryland and Pennsylvania. There were conflicts with natives over land across all British colonies, and the plantation economy and the indentured servitude that was being used to work in the plantation up until 1676. All right, that is it for this topic. We will continue on with period 2 on the next set of lectures. So I will see you then.